I'm honored to get to spend a few minutes with you, even though the topic that I'm addressing, honestly, is a difficult one. It's something that's personal for me. In fact, it involves an issue that I've spent the better part of my adult life, actually, trying to keep a secret, even from people that I love and am close to. And when I say what it is, you might kind of shrug and go, what's the big deal? But it's simply this. I struggle with anxiety and depression. And I don't know why I kept it such a big secret for so long. Maybe it's just pride. It may have to do with the fact that I'm a guy. And I don't know about you, but things like panic attacks don't exactly scream manliness. I don't see many action movies where the main character gets in stressful situations and starts hyperventilating and taking his pulse or just gets bummed out for no apparent reason. Whatever the reason, it got so silly where I was kind of keeping this secret where I'd actually have people come to me and they would divulge that they were dealing with this. And I would listen carefully and nod thoughtfully and go, oh man, that sounds hard. Praying for you, man. And not even come clean about the fact that I was dealing with the same issue. It's nuts. I heard someone say of mental illness that it's people keeping a secret from people who are keeping the same secret from them. Isn't that how it works sometimes? It just doesn't make any sense because it is such a common struggle. Around 20% of people will at some point in their lives deal in a serious way with anxiety or depression. I've seen some studies that actually say the numbers are higher for people that are in creative fields. And I don't know why that is, but it seems that folks with a more creative bent seem to get hit with this harder. So I know that in a room this size with this many people, and many of you are artists and musicians and thinkers and teachers and folks that just live in this realm of aesthetics and ideas, I know I'm far from alone. So here's the deal. I'm just going to share a little bit from my experience. I'm going to talk about 2 lessons that I've learned. If you are someone that's dealt with this issue as well, what I'm hoping is that something that I say will be beneficial to you. If you're someone who doesn't struggle with this, praise God. But I hope that you'll find something that I say useful for when you interact with people that do, because obviously a lot of people do. The first lesson I learned is this, and I learned it the hard way. Don't struggle with this alone. When I was in seminary in my mid-20s, I had a nervous breakdown. And I realize that's probably not the technical name for what happened. Psychologists would probably describe it differently, perhaps. And yet, that phrase, nervous breakdown, does capture something of the strange and debilitating effects of what occurred. Around this time, I started experiencing these intense episodes where I felt like I was dying, like the room was closing in on me or someone was standing on my chest. I couldn't breathe. My heart would race. A few times, I even landed in the emergency room, convinced that I was dying of some awful disease, and I'd come in with a diagnosis for the doctor, and they'd just kind of shake their heads. But needless to say, this was very disruptive to my life. I had to drop all of my classes. I was freelance writing kind of as a sideline at that point, and I blew past all my deadlines. Because I just couldn't concentrate. I couldn't concentrate enough to read books or write essays or even to listen to a full lecture. And the weird thing is that it seemed to hit me out of the blue. Now that I look back, in retrospect, I think I've always had some psychological quirks. When I was a kid, I'd obsess over weird things. I still remember when I was 6 years old, the day before I went to first grade, I stayed up all night, like pacing the hall outside my bedroom because I was so freaked out about going to school the next day. And my mom, I remember just looking at me and going, what's wrong with this kid? I've also always been super not into spiders. I don't know if that means anything. But they're evil. And to this day, I will actually check my bed sheets before I get in just to make sure there are no spiders in there, right? Same with my shoes. I'm not going to put my foot in there, not knowing. And I'm told this is weird. I kind of think it's weird not to check. But, that's your choice. But these were just kind of little quirks and oddities and a little annoying, but nothing severe. But man, when that first episode hit me in seminary, it was like a sledgehammer. And really, it couldn't have come at a worse time because we were brand new to the area. It was Pasadena, my wife and I. And, when it all came down, we didn't have any friends yet, a few acquaintances. We weren't involved with a church, which is weird because I was going to seminary, right? But I figured, I'm getting enough Bible during the day, and, we're not going to be here forever, so why plug into a church? I mean, what's the point? Big mistake. Because when this crashed into my life, the only person I had to talk to was my wife, my long-suffering wife, and she was amazing, and she was supportive, and she was scared. She was 22, and she was kind of wondering, what's going on with this guy that seemed solid that I married? It was quite an upheaval for us. And it was my own fault, really, because honestly, even when I realized that I was in rough shape, my instinct was just to close myself off and just fix it myself. That's what I was going to do. And that, I think, prolonged that experience. And I've just realized since then how important it is. God places us in community for a reason. We aren't made to navigate life on our own. And I think that's probably doubly true for those of us who struggle with some form of mental illness. Today, I do have a network of folks in my life that help me with this. And it's a blessing, who check in with me, make sure I'm not too stressed, not working too hard, that kind of stuff, even though they don't always do it in the most sensitive way. My father-in-law, he's this big Irish guy, and I'll be over at his house sometimes, and if we get a moment alone in the living room, he'll kind of look around, lean over toward me very seriously and go, "Drew, how's the craziness?" I appreciate it, though. He's just looking out for me. But I want to encourage you, when you are in that bad psychological place, it can really feel like God's up and left, right? That God's abandoned you. It may be, though, that he's going to show up through the people that he's placed in your life. And don't be close to that. Don't fight this alone. The second lesson is this: use it to grow spiritually. I do believe that there are spiritual benefits, as hard as this can be, to dealing with depression and anxiety. I've been spending a lot of time recently in the book of Ecclesiastes. And man, talk about depression. Solomon, or whoever wrote the book, was kind of the original Debbie Downer, right? It's like success, wealth, it's empty, pleasure, meaningless. And I love how it starts, right? Because the author gives this, or the preacher, I should say, gives this resume, and it's incredibly impressive. Most successful guy in the world at that point, right? And then he systematically goes through all the things that you think would make you happy, and he says, you know what? I've done them. And you know what? They're hevel. That's the Hebrew word for vapor. Something that you can see, it looks tangible, and then you go to grab it and it just disappears. It's meaningless. It's an illusion. These things don't bring joy. And that's a little grim, but it's really been a revelation to me. And I'll tell you why. Because I suffer from this persistent illusion that the antidote for my depression is out there somewhere, right? And usually the depression and the anxiety will kick in when I'm feeling badly about myself. Usually it centers around not accomplishing enough or being important in some way. And then I think, okay, well, just wait though. If I do this, if I do something super meaningful or some high impact thing or accomplish this, then the fog will lift, the skies will part, and I'll be happy for good. But Ecclesiastes says, nope, that doesn't work. Happiness is not waiting for you on the other side of success. It feels like it, but it's an illusion. And yet that's the lie we not only hear from ourselves, but ad nauseum, emanating from the broader culture, right? If you just do this or that, if you, buy a bigger house or become successful or famous or have that perfect marriage or perfect kids, then you'll be happy. But it's a lie. And I think it's one that's especially seductive for those of us who struggle with depression. The message, of course, of the cross is starkly different. In fact, it's just the opposite. It tells us that satisfaction isn't found in accomplishments or experience. There's no easy escape from suffering, and that sometimes the way up is actually to go down. Now, I'm a proud person. I have a lot of opinions, and I generously share them with other people. When I had that experience, though, in seminary, it just changed that. And sometimes I wonder if God didn't use the whole thing to take me out at the knees, you know? Because for the first time in my life, I was completely vulnerable. I was meek. I was empty. And the Greek word for that is kenosis, right? And this is what the Bible describes that happened to Jesus when he emptied himself, setting aside even claims to divinity to take on the form of a suffering servant. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing myself to Jesus. My kenosis, and it really was that, wasn't voluntary, and yet I feel like it yielded some spiritual benefits nonetheless. Nothing drives home my weakness and my limitedness like dealing with depression. And spiritually speaking, I don't think that's a bad place to be. You know, of course, I always want to look good while I'm growing spiritually, right? It's like, I kind of envision it like a triathlete scaling up a little mountain, and you're progressing, and it looks great. But the truth is, in my experience, when I look back on my life, the moments in which I've grown don't look like that. In fact, sometimes spiritual growth feels an awful lot like pain. I loved what Joe said about Jesus being the man of sorrows, and that's something that resonates with me. And I'm not saying Jesus was depressed, because that just gets theologically weird. But I will say this, he had his eyes wide open to the sorrows and the pain, the sadness, and the tragedy of this world. And I think sometimes people who struggle with depression have a greater sensitivity to the same thing. Now, depression can be awful. I'm not trying to romanticize it. But if our goal is to completely banish any sort of depression from our lives, it would actually, I think, be to limit a way in which we're uniquely Christ-like. Since my breakdown, things have gotten a lot better. You know, for a while that meant being on medication, 9 years in fact. It was something I fought to my detriment. I want to say to you, if you need medication, take it. It meant getting some coping mechanisms. It meant recognizing my triggers, getting that supportive godly community around me. But here's the thing, I still struggle with it. Maybe I always will. But at the end of the day, I think that's okay. And I'll tell you why, because my faith doesn't rest completely on my feelings. Something I love about the gospel is that it's true no matter your psychological state. It doesn't change. Ultimately, it's not reliant upon me. The hope of the gospel is found in Christ. And here's the thing, when I'm depressed, Jesus still came to earth, right? When I'm feeling anxious, he still died for my sins. When I'm down, he still rose from the grave. When I'm hopeless, he's still coming back. And even when I'm in deep despair, I can still hear his promise. Behold, I make all things new. And that's good news indeed. Thank you.